Chapter 1. The Embarkation at Southampton. The rain fell in thin silver needles upon the quayside at Southampton, yet it did nothing to dampen the excitement that crackled like static among the first-class passengers boarding the SS Atlantica. Porters in crisp white uniforms darted beneath black umbrellas. Trunks the size of small motor cars were swung aboard by cranes. And the ship's band played a jaunty rendition of Anything Goes that felt almost defiant against the grey English sky. Hercule Poirot, wrapped in a thick camel hair coat and a muffler wound twice about his throat, stood at the foot of the gangway and regarded the liner with the expression of a cat being asked to take a bath. Mon Dieu, he murmured to himself, 5 days upon the restless bosom of the Atlantic. 5 days without proper croissants. It is a punishment invented by the English. Beside him, Captain Hastings, ever loyal, ever enthusiastic, beamed like a schoolboy. I say, Poirot, isn't she a corker? 45,000 tons, Turkish baths, a winter garden, even a squash court. And Deck 7 is supposed to be the crème de la crème. Only 20 suites, all by private invitation. Poirot's moustaches gave a slight quiver of disapproval. Invitation. I, Hercule Poirot, do not require invitation. I was persuaded, nay, blackmailed, by a certain Lady Horbury, who insists I accompany her to New York for my health. My health, Hastings, is perfect. It is my patience that suffers. A steward in immaculate white gloves appeared at Poirot's elbow. Monsieur Poirot, Suite 7A, sir. Allow me to take your valises. Poirot surrendered his 2 perfectly matched cases, one for clothes, one for the essential toiletries of a gentleman, and followed the man up the gangway with the resigned dignity of a condemned aristocrat mounting the scaffold. Deck 7 was reached by a private lift, lined in bird's-eye maple and brass. When the gates opened, Poirot found himself in a hushed, carpeted corridor that smelled faintly of beeswax and tuberose. Crystal sconces cast soft pools of light on mahogany doors, each bearing a discreet Roman numeral in gold. Suite 7A was at the very end, starboard side, with a private promenade deck. Inside, green silk walls, a bed vast enough for a cardinal, and a bathroom of Connemara marble greeted him. Poirot gave a single approving nod, then immediately opened his case and began arranging his dressing table with military precision. The brushes aligned, the eau de cologne at exactly 45 degrees, the photograph of his late brother placed just so. A gentle knock sounded. "Entrez!" Poirot called, not turning. The door opened to reveal a tall young woman in a travelling suit of dove-grey wool, a small hat tilted provocatively over one eye. Her smile was slow, almost sleepy, and her voice carried the faintest trace of Vienna. "Herr Poirot, I am told we are neighbours. Ilse von Hofmannsthal, Suite 7B. Wish to pay my respects to the greatest detective in Europe." Poirot bowed with exquisite correctness. "Mademoiselle von Hofmannsthal, your reputation precedes you also. The newspapers, they call you the Black Orchid of the Vienna Opera." "Enchanté." She laughed softly. "Newspapers exaggerate. I am merely a singer who has tired of Europe's quarrels. America promises new stages, and new audiences who do not remember old scandals." Before Poirot could reply, a louder, more jovial voice boomed from the corridor. "Good God, is that little Hercule Poirot I see, still polishing your moustaches like a French poodle?" Into the doorway strode Colonel Archibald Race, retired Indian Army, face burnt brick red by decades of Punjab sun, moustaches that rivaled Poirot's own in magnificence. "Race, mon vieux!" Poirot's eyes lit with genuine pleasure. "You too are banished to this floating palace. Invited, dear fellow, invited. Some American film magnate wants advice on security for his yachts, pays obscenely well. And you? Poirot sighed theatrically. I am the victim of feminine tyranny. From further along the corridor came the sharp click of a walking stick. An elderly woman swathed in sable and diamonds appeared, leaning heavily on the arm of a colourless secretary. Poirot, Lady Honoria Horbury announced, as though addressing a slightly disappointing footman. I trust you're satisfied with your accommodation. I personally instructed the purser. Lady Horbury, your solicitude overwhelms me, Poirot said with a bow that somehow managed to be both courteous and ironic. Behind her, a thin, nervous man with a monocle, Sir Gervais Chevenix the diplomat, muttered something about damned extravagant and disappeared into Suite 7D. A final figure drifted past the open door. A pale young man in an artist's velvet jacket, carrying a portfolio almost as large as himself. He paused, glanced inside, gave a shy half-smile, and continued toward the last suite, 7 Piquet. Who is that? Poirot asked. Ilse von Hofmannsthal answered, amused. Mr. Lucien Vale, the painter. They say he has been commissioned to do portraits of everyone on deck 7. A strange commission, no? We are 20 strangers thrown together for 5 days, and already someone wishes us immortalized. Colonel Race chuckled. Probably wants to sell them to the New York papers. Doomed aristocrats of the Atlantic. Makes a good headline. Lady Horbury gave a delicate shudder. Doomed! Really, Colonel, what a vulgar word. The ship's sirens sounded. 3 deep resonant blasts that vibrated through the soles of their shoes. Somewhere far below, the engines thrummed to life. Hastings poked his head in. We're off, Poirot! Come and watch England disappear. Poirot allowed himself to be shepherded onto the private promenade deck. The rain had stopped. A pale sun glimmered on wet railings. As the great liner eased away from the quay, tugs fussing like sheepdogs, the 20 passengers of Deck 7 gathered in small knots, raising glasses of champagne provided by white-gloved stewards. Poirot surveyed them all with his bright, inquisitive eyes. The opera singer, the soldier, the diplomat, the dowager, the painter, the American heiress in emerald silk, the mysterious French count with the dueling scar, the nervous clergyman clutching a large Bible, and others, each seemingly unconnected, each carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of secrets. Far beneath them, the band struck up Auld Lang Syne as Southampton slipped astern. Poirot raised his glass to his moustaches and murmured so softly that only the wind heard, should old acquaintance be forgot, or should they be remembered a little too well? 5 nights later, one of those 20 passengers would vanish as completely as if the sea had opened and swallowed them. But for now, the SS Atlantica steamed proudly westward, and Deck 7 glittered like a jewel box full of hidden flaws. Hey, detective, quick question. Where in the world are you solving mysteries from? Drop your city in the comments. And if you want more twisted tales, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's case, it gets even creepier. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. The Captain's Welcome Dinner. The first night at sea, the Atlantic lay as smooth as black glass, reflecting a sky pricked with cold, brilliant stars. In the main restaurant, the chandeliers blazed like captive constellations, but on Deck 7, the dining was intimate. A single oval table of rare Amboina wood set for exactly 20, beneath a dome painted with nymphs and dolphins. Crystal, silver, and the low murmur of privileged voices made the room feel less like a ship, and more like a private London club that had somehow learned to float. Captain Etienne Laroche, resplendent in midnight blue and gold, stood at the head and raised a glass of 1921 Pol Roger. To new horizons, he toasted, and to the most distinguished company the Atlantica has ever carried on her highest deck. 20 glasses rose in answer. Poirot, seated at the captain's right, Lady Horbury had insisted, noted with quiet satisfaction that the champagne was properly chilled. Small mercies. Across from him sat Ilse von Hofmannsthal, gowned in midnight velvet that left her shoulders bare and gleaming like alabaster. To her left, Lucien Vale the painter seemed unable to decide whether to stare at her or at his consommé. Colonel Race, on Poirot's other side, attacked his oysters with the gusto of a man who had survived too many indifferent regimental messes. Conversation began lightly. Weather, the excellence of the orchestra, the rumour that a Maharaja had tried to book the entire deck and been refused. Then Sir Gervas Chevenix's monocle flashing, leaned forward. "I hear, Captain, that this ship once carried the Duke of Windsor when he was still Prince of Wales. And a certain American lady." La Roche's smile did not waver, but the temperature at the table seemed to drop a degree. "Sir Gervais," the captain said smoothly, "the Atlantica has carried many illustrious personages. Discretion is our most prized cargo." Lady Horbury gave a tinkling laugh that set her diamonds trembling. "Discretion! How deliciously old-fashioned! In Hollywood, they would pay fortunes for indiscretion." The American heiress, Miss Daphne Wade, 22, bobbed hair, and a necklace of sapphires large enough to ransom a Balkan kingdom, leaned toward Lucien Vale. "Tell me, Mr. Vale, do you really intend to paint all of us? Even poor Reverend Timms, who looks as though sunlight might dissolve him." The clergyman in question, a thin, blinking man with a dog collar that seemed 2 sizes too large, flushed crimson. I consented only because the fee will rebuild the roof of St. Botolph's," he stammered. Lucien Vale's pale, almost translucent fingers toyed with the stem of his glass. "Portraits reveal truth, Miss Wade. Sometimes more truth than the sitter wishes." His voice was soft, yet it carried. Several people glanced up sharply. Poirot's eyes narrowed with interest. The young man had the feverish intensity of one who sees beneath surfaces, dangerous perhaps. At the far end of the table, the French Comte de Rochefort, tall, saturnine, a white scar bisecting his left cheek, lifted an eyebrow. "Truth," he repeated, tasting the word like spoiled wine. "An overrated commodity, monsieur. Some truths are better left at the bottom of the sea." Ilse von Hofmannsthal laughed, low and musical. "Aristide, you sound positively sinister. One would think you had skeletons rattling in your Louis XIV armoires." The Comte's smile was thin. "My dear Ilse, every armoire in Europe rattles. It is merely a question of how loudly." A nervous ripple of laughter followed. The orchestra, discreetly placed behind a lattice screen, began a languorous tango. Couples drifted toward the small polished floor. Colonel Race with Miss Wade, Sir Gervais with Lady Horbury's secretary, a plain girl who looked terrified of being noticed. Poirot remained seated, observing. The Comte de Rochefort was now bending close to Ilse von Hofmannsthal, murmuring something that made her lovely eyes widen for a fraction of a second before the mask of amusement slipped back into place. Lucien Vale watched them both with the fixity of a starving man regarding a locked banquet. Captain Laroche leaned toward Poirot. "You see, monsieur, how quickly old Europe begins to devour itself, even on my peaceful ship." Poirot twirled the ends of his moustache. "Peaceful, Capitaine? I think not. I smell secrets the way a dog smells truffles. And secrets, they have a distinctive odour, half perfume, half decay." Laroche chuckled. "Then I place deck 7 in your capable hands, Monsieur Poirot. Should anything untoward occur, I shall know whom to summon." At that moment the lights flickered, just once, as though the ship had drawn a startled breath. Several ladies gasped. When brilliance returned, Lucien Vale was on his feet, deathly pale, staring at an empty place at the table. "Mr. Goldstein," he whispered. "He was sitting there a moment ago." All heads turned. Indeed, the chair to the left of Reverend Timms was vacant. A half-finished plate of sole meunière sat cooling. A napkin crumpled beside it like a white flag of surrender. Captain Laroche rose, calm but swift. "A touch of mal de mer, no doubt. My steward will check his suite." Yet, even as he spoke, Poirot noticed that the place card still rested by the plate. It read, in elegant copperplate, "Mr. Elias Goldstein, Suite 7. J. Goldstein," Poirot recalled, was the quiet, grey-bearded banker from Antwerp, who had spoken to no one all evening except to compliment the captain on the wine. He had the eyes of a man perpetually calculating interest and risk. Colonel Race gave a short laugh. "Probably hiding in his cabin counting his millions. Jews hate leaving money unattended, what?" An appalled silence fell. Ilse von Hofmannsthal's hand went to her throat. Sir Gervas looked as though he wished the floor would swallow him. Poirot's voice cut the quiet like a scalpel. "Colonel, that remark was in the worst of taste, and inaccurate. A man who disappears between the fish and the soufflé is not counting money. He is either very ill or very afraid." Captain Laroche signalled urgently to the maître d'hôtel. Within moments 2 stewards hurried away to search. Dessert was served in near silence. The orchestra played on, but no one danced now. At 11:30, as the company began to disperse, Captain Laroche reappeared in the doorway. His face was grim. "Monsieur Poirot," he said quietly, "a word, if you please." Poirot followed him into the private corridor, outside the dining room. The captain closed the door. "Goldstein is not in his suite," Laroche said without preamble. "His bed has not been slept in. His evening clothes are laid out, his jewellery untouched, but there is this." He held out a single playing card, edges crisp and new, the Queen of Spades. On the back, someone had scrawled in black ink, "The first to vanish. There will be more." Poirot turned the card over in his neat fingers, his eyes glittering like green ice. "Interesting," he murmured, "very interesting. The Queen of Spades, the card of misfortune, of widowhood, of death. Someone, Capitaine, is playing a most dangerous game." Far above them, the ship's bell struck 12 slow notes into the night. Poirot looked up toward the deckhead, as though he could see through steel and wood to the 20 luxurious suites. "Tell me, mon ami," he said softly, "how many passengers exactly are there on deck 7 tonight?" Laroche hesitated. 19, monsieur. Mr. Goldstein makes the 20th. Or did." Poirot gave a small, precise nod. "Then we begin," he said, "with one missing, and the game, I think, has only just started." Chapter 3. Whispers in the Night. Hercule Poirot did not sleep well that first night. The Atlantic, treacherous coquette that she was, had decided to flirt with a long, lazy swell. The great ship rolled gently, just enough to remind every passenger that they were no longer on solid earth. In Suite 7A, the crystal carafe on Poirot's nightstand gave out tiny musical chimes each time the vessel dipped, like a mischievous spirit tapping on glass. At 2:30 he rose, slipped his feet into green Morocco slippers, and wrapped himself in a dressing-gown of quilted burgundy silk. The little detective disliked disorder in any form, even the disorder of insomnia. He opened his door and stepped into the corridor. Deck 7 was never truly dark. Low amber nightlights glowed along the carpet runner, and from somewhere came the faint scent of Turkish tobacco and tuberose. All doors were closed, yet Poirot's sharp ears caught the smallest sounds. A cough behind 7th C, the creak of bed springs in 7th Def, the soft scrape of a chair being moved in 7th J, Goldstein's empty suite. He glided silently toward that door. It stood ajar. Poirot's eyebrows rose a fraction. Stewards had locked it hours ago. Captain Laroche had been most insistent. Yet now the brass tongue of the lock rested innocently outward. Someone had been here since. He pushed the door with one careful finger. Moonlight spilled through the porthole in a silver blade across the sitting room. The air felt colder than the corridor, as though a window had been opened to the night sea. Poirot's gaze swept the room. The evening clothes still laid out like a corpse on the chaise longue. The leather jewel case untouched, the half-written letter on the blotter, something about diamonds, Antwerp, cannot be moved until... But it was the small occasional table that arrested him. Upon it lay a second playing card, placed exactly in the centre. The King of Spades this time. And beneath it, a single white gardenia, freshly cut, its petals already browning at the edges as though bruised by cruel fingers. Poirot picked up the flower delicately between kid-gloved fingers. He never travelled without gloves, even for midnight prowling. The scent was heavy, almost cloying, the perfume favoured by only one person on board. Ilse von Hofmannsthal. Tiens, he murmured. The plot, she thickens. A floorboard creaked behind him. Poirot turned swiftly, but the sitting room was empty. The sound had come from the bedroom beyond. He crossed the carpet in 4 silent steps and looked in. Nothing. The bed was untouched, the pillows plump and innocent. Yet the porthole stood open 6 inches. And the lace curtain bellied inward like a ghost trying to enter. Poirot closed and latched it with a decisive click. Then he pocketed both the King of Spades and the dying gardenia, and returned to the corridor. As he did so, a door further along opened the merest crack. A pale face peered out. Lucien Vale, hair tousled, eyes wide and frightened. "Monsieur Poirot," the young painter whispered. Is someone there?" "Only the little Belgian who cannot sleep," Poirot replied calmly. "Return to your bed, mon jeune. Dreams are safer than reality tonight." Vale hesitated, then withdrew. The door shut with a tremulous snick. Poirot stood motionless a long moment, head cocked like a bird. Then he walked the entire length of the private corridor, counting doors, listening. At the very end, where the companionway led up to the boat deck, he discovered a small puddle of seawater on the carpet and one clear footprint. Narrow, high-arched, a woman's evening shoe. He bent, touched the water, salt and still cold. "Curieux," he said to the silence. "Someone has been dancing with Neptune himself." When he regained his suite, Poirot did not return to bed. Instead, he sat at the writing desk, switched on the green-shaded lamp, and took from his pocket a small leather notebook. With his neat continental handwriting, he began a list. Ulcius Goldstein. Disappeared between fish and soufflé. Queen of Spades left in dining saloon, King of Spades. Plus gardenia in empty suite open porthole. Size sufficient for a slender person. Footprint of lady's shoe in seawater. Mademoiselle von Hofmannsthal wears gardenia. Coincidence? No. He paused, tapped the fountain pen against his teeth, and added, "Someone wishes us to believe this is a game. But games have rules. I must discover them before another card is played." A soft knock startled him. 3 light taps, almost furtive. Poirot rose, crossed the room, and opened the door. Ilse von Hofmannsthal stood there in a dressing gown of black satin, her golden hair loose upon her shoulders. In the amber light, she looked very young and, for once, uncertain. "Forgive me, monsieur," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I saw your light. I cannot sleep either. May I come in? I must speak with someone, or I think I shall scream." Poirot stepped aside with a small bow. "Enter, mademoiselle. Hercule Poirot is always at the service of a beautiful woman who is frightened." She slipped inside, closed the door, and leaned against it as though the corridor itself pursued her. "It is foolish," she began, "but earlier, after the captain's dinner, I returned to my suite. On my pillow someone had left this." She opened her hand. In the palm lay a third card, the Ace of Spades. No writing this time, yet the message was unmistakable. Poirot took it from her, careful that their fingers should not touch. "You are being warned," he said quietly, "or threatened, possibly both." "I thought it was a joke," she said, attempting a laugh that broke halfway, "until Mr. Goldstein vanished, and now—" Her voice dropped. "I'm not a coward, monsieur. I have sung Tristan, with bombs falling on Vienna. But this feels personal." Poirot regarded her steadily. "Tell me, mademoiselle, do you know why Elias Goldstein was travelling to New York?" She shook her head. "Only that he was carrying something of great value. He hinted as much to the Comte de Rochefort at dinner. Something about stones that remember the blood they were bought with." "Interesting," Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And the gardenia, your flower, that I found in his cabin?" Her hand flew to her throat. "I lost one from my corsage during the tango. Anyone could have picked it up." "Anyone?" Poirot echoed politely. Silence stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. At last she said, very low, "There is a legend about Deck 7, did you know? Before the war, when this ship was the SS Imperator, a woman threw herself from this very deck. They say on certain nights she walks again, looking for her lover who betrayed her. Sailors swear they have seen a figure in white at the rail." Poirot gave a soft snort. "I do not believe in ghosts, mademoiselle, only in men and women who find it convenient that others should." He moved to the sideboard, poured 2 small glasses of Benedictine, and offered her one. "Drink, it fortifies the nerves." She took it with a trembling hand, drank, then met his gaze squarely. "If someone on this deck is playing a deadly game," she said, "promise me you will stop them before the next card is turned." Poirot inclined his head. "I give you the word of Hercule Poirot." She set down the glass, gathered her dignity like a cloak, and left as silently as she had come. Poirot locked the door behind her, returned to his notebook, and beneath his list wrote a single new line. "The Black Orchid is terrified, and she is not a woman who terrifies easily." Outside, the ship rolled again. Far away in the dark, something or someone knocked 3 times against the hull. A hollow, patient sound, like a coffin lid, asking to be let in. Poirot closed the notebook, turned off the light, and sat in darkness. "Patience," he told the knight. "The cards are only beginning to be dealt." Chapter 4. The vanishing artist morning found the Atlantic transformed. A low pewter sky pressed down upon a sea the colour of gunmetal, and the great liner ploughed through long, deliberate swells that made the chandeliers in the Deck 7 lounge tinkle like anxious bells. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Only 9 passengers appeared. The empty places at the table looked like missing teeth. Poirot, immaculate in a charcoal suit with a white carnation, took his seat and observed everything. Lady Horbury was pale beneath her rouge. Sir Gervais's monocle trembled as he buttered toast he did not eat. The Reverend Mr. Timms read his pocket testament with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. The Comte de Rochefort was absent. So was Lucien Vale. Captain Laroche entered at 8:30, grave and correct. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I regret to inform you that Mr. Elias Goldstein is still missing. The ship has been searched from bilge to bridge. No trace. At present we must assume the worst, that he went overboard during the night." A collective gasp rippled around the table. Miss Daphne Wade, the American heiress, gave a small theatrical cry. "Overboard? But how? The rails are 5 feet high." "Nevertheless," Laroche said quietly, "it has happened before. A sudden lurch, a man leaning too far." Colonel Race muttered something about damned careless, but his eyes were uneasy. Poirot raised one delicate hand. "Capitaine, if I may, was the deck patrolled last night?" "Every hour, monsieur. The officer of the watch saw nothing unusual. Yet a man vanishes, a porthole stands open, cards of evil omen appear, and a gardenia is left like a calling card. These are not the actions of a wave, mon ami." Laroche inclined his head. "Quite so. I have therefore sealed Deck 7 to all but its own passengers and crew. No one enters or leaves without my permission, and I have asked Monsieur Poirot to advise us." Every face turned toward the little Belgian. Some looked relieved, some openly frightened, one or two hostile. Lady Horbury set down her coffee cup with a clatter. "Really, this is absurd. One Jew banker loses his balance, and suddenly we are prisoners." "Lady Horbury," Poirot said mildly, "a man does not lose his balance wearing patent leather shoes on a dry deck, and he does not leave playing cards behind him like breadcrumbs." Before anyone could reply, the door opened and Lucien Vale slipped in, pale, dishevelled, dark rings beneath his eyes. He carried his large portfolio clutched to his chest as though it were armour. "Forgive my lateness," he said breathlessly. "I was working." "Working?" Ilse von Hofmannsthal echoed, arching a perfect brow. "All night, Lucien. You look as though you have seen the ghost of Deck 7. The young man flinched as if struck. "I do not believe in ghosts, Fräulein. Only in faces that refuse to stay on canvas." He took his seat, opened the portfolio, and slid out a single charcoal sketch for the table to see. It was a portrait of Elias Goldstein, done with feverish speed. The heavy-lidded eyes, the neat grey beard, the slight stoop of the shoulders. But the face had been violently scored through with black crayon, again and again, until the paper was almost torn. A horrified silence fell. Vale's hands shook. "I drew it from memory at dawn. When I finished, something made me destroy it. I cannot explain." Reverend Timms crossed himself hurriedly. Poirot alone remained calm. He reached across and took the ruined drawing. "Interesting," he murmured. "You feel guilt, monsieur? Or fear?" "Both," Vale whispered. At that moment, a steward appeared at Poirot's elbow and handed him a folded note, on heavy ship's stationery. Poirot opened it. Written in the same black ink as the playing cards. "The Queen is taken. The King follows. The artist is next." Beneath the words, a crude sketch of an easel overturned, a palette knife buried in the canvas. Poirot folded the note once and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. "Capitaine Laroche," he said pleasantly, "it seems our correspondent has a sense of drama, and of rhyme, however poor." Laroche's face darkened. "From this moment, Monsieur Vale, you will not be left alone. A steward will accompany you at all times. But my work, your life, monsieur, is more precious than your work." The breakfast ended in whispers and the scrape of chairs. Passengers drifted away like smoke. Lucien Vale was escorted to his suite by two burly crewmen who looked absurdly out of place among the Louis XV furniture. Poirot lingered, watching the artists retreating back. Ilse von Hofmannsthal paused beside him. "You believe he's truly in danger?" "I believe," Poirot said, "that someone wishes us to think so. Whether the danger is real or a diversion, that is the question." She laid a gloved hand lightly on his sleeve. "And the ace of spades on my pillow. That, mademoiselle, was intended to terrify you. It succeeded. Therefore we must ask, who profits from your terror?" She had no answer, only a troubled glance toward the Comte de Rochefort, who had appeared at last, immaculate, in dove-grey morning dress, a gardenia in his buttonhole. The day passed in brittle calm. The ship drove westward beneath a sky that grew steadily more menacing. Passengers kept to their suites, or gathered in nervous knots in the private lounge, speaking in low voices, starting at every footfall. At 4 o'clock the light began to fail early, as though night were impatient. Poirot took a turn on the private promenade deck, collar turned up against the wind. The sea had grown restless. Whitecaps flecked the waves like torn lace. He was alone, or believed himself to be. A sudden sound, half cry, half sob, came from the starboard side, where a canvas screen shielded the lifeboats. Poirot moved swiftly. Behind the screen, Lucien Vale struggled in the grip of an unseen assailant. A hand was clamped over his mouth, another held a thin, gleaming blade at his throat. Poirot did not hesitate. "Stop!" he cried in a voice that could have shattered crystal. "Lâchez-le immédiatement!" The attacker whirled. For an instant, Poirot saw a masked face, black silk, eye-holes glittering. Then the figure released Vale, lunged past Poirot with the speed of a striking cobra, and vanished through a service door that slammed behind him. Vale collapsed to his knees, gasping, a thin line of blood on his collar where the knife had kissed the skin. Poirot knelt, supporting him. "Courage, mon ami! It is over!" But Vale's eyes were fixed on something beyond Poirot's shoulder. His lips moved, soundlessly. Poirot turned. Propped against the rail, exactly where a man might lean to watch the sunset, was Lucien Vale's large leather portfolio. Its flap hung open. Inside, every sketch, every portrait he had begun of the passengers of Deck 7 had been slashed to ribbons, and pinned to the wreckage with the same palette knife that had threatened his life was a single card, the Jack of Spades. Face up, the painted figure grinned like a devil. By the time Captain Laroche and his officers arrived, the deck was empty save for Poirot, the trembling artist, and the cold Atlantic wind. Laroche stared at the ruined portfolio, at the playing card fluttering like a trapped moth. "Mon Dieu," he said heavily. "First Goldstein disappears. Now an attempt on Vale. This is no longer a prank, Poirot. This is madness." Poirot's eyes were very green in the failing light. "Not madness, Capitaine," he said softly. "Method. Someone on this deck is eliminating threats one by one, and the choice of cards is deliberate. Queen, king, ace, now jack." He tapped the card thoughtfully. In the old French packs, the Jack of Spades was sometimes called Lancelot du Lac, the knight who betrayed his king for love, or who was betrayed. He looked out over the darkening sea. "Tell me, Capitaine, how many passengers remain on Deck 7 tonight?" Laroche did not need to count. 18, he said, "and the storm is coming." Far away on the horizon, lightning flickered like a warning. Chapter 5. Interrogations over tea. The storm arrived at 5 o'clock with the suddenness of a theatre curtain slammed down. The sky turned the colour of a fresh bruise. The wind rose to a howl that rattled the triple-glazed portholes of Deck 7, as though 1,000 fists demanded entry. The Atlantica, for all her 45,000 tons, began to pitch like a skittish horse. China danced in the cupboards, and somewhere a steward's tray crashed to the floor in a symphony of breaking Sèvres. Captain Laroche closed the private promenade deck, posted armed officers at both companionways, and turned the Winter Garden Lounge into a temporary prison. No one was to leave until Hercule Poirot had spoken to each of them, alone. The lounge had been arranged with military precision. A single table and 2 gilt chairs waited beneath the glass dome, now lashed by rain that streamed down in silver rivers. A samovar hissed gently on a sideboard. The scent of Darjeeling and lemon did battle with the ozone smell of the storm. Poirot entered at 6, impeccable despite the chaos. Dove-grey suit, spats the colour of fresh cream, the white carnation replaced by a tiny black ribbon of mourning for the dignity of the voyage. One by one they came. First, Lucien Vale, bandage at his throat, eyes still wild. "I saw nothing, monsieur," he insisted, voice cracking. "Only the mask, black silk and the smell, gardenia and wet wool." Poirot poured tea with ceremonial calm. "You are an artist, monsieur. You notice faces, expressions, the hands that held the knife. What of them?" Vale closed his eyes, reliving terror. Gloved, black kid gloves, but the wrists, thin, almost delicate. A woman's wrists, I thought, yet the strength was frightening. Poirot made a small note. "And your sketches, why destroy them?" "Because I painted what I should not have seen," Vale whispered. "In every face on this deck I began to see guilt, even my own." He was dismissed with a gentle pat on the shoulder and a cup of brandy-laced tea. Next, Ilse von Hofmannsthal. She entered like a ship under full sail, chin high, but Poirot saw the pulse beating at her throat. "You wish to know where I was at 4 o'clock," she said before sitting. "In my cabin, alone, reading Werfel, no witness. How inconvenient for you, monsieur." Poirot smiled. "Inconvenient, perhaps, but truthful. Sit, mademoiselle, sugar. 2 lumps, and lemon, never milk." She watched him prepare the cup with the wariness of a duellist. "You suspect me because of the gardenia." "I suspect everyone," Poirot said pleasantly. "It is my métier. Tell me, why does the ace of spades frighten you more than most?" She was silent so long he thought she would not answer. Then, "Because in Vienna, before I fled, a man I cared for received the same card the night he was taken from his apartment. They found him in the Danube 3 days later. The ace means death, monsieur. Final, aristocratic death." She set the cup down, untouched. If someone is recreating that nightmare, they chose the wrong woman to terrify. Poirot's eyes gleamed, or precisely the right one. She left with a rustle of silk and the faint, lingering perfume of gardenia. Colonel Race came next, hearty and bristling. "Damned nonsense, Poirot. Fellow probably tripped and fell overboard. As for young Vale, hysterical type, artists always are. Probably cut himself shaving and imagined the rest." Poirot regarded him mildly. "You were on deck at 3:30, I understand, taking the air." "Needed a gasper. Filthy habit, but a man's entitled. Saw nothing except bloody rain coming." "And your service revolver, mon colonel? It is still in your possession?" Race flushed to the roots of his white moustache. "Naturally. Though why you—" "Precautions merely," Poirot soothed. "One cannot be too careful when knives appear." Sir Gervais Chevenix was brief and pompous. He had been asleep. His secretary could confirm. He wished the whole affair at the devil. Lady Horbury swept in, wrapped in sables despite the warmth, announced that her nerves were shattered, and demanded a police escort back to England the moment they reached New York. The Comte de Rochefort was last of the principal players. He entered without hurry, accepted tea, and leaned back with the indolent grace of a panther. "You amuse me, Poirot," he said, stirring, his cup with a tiny silver spoon. "You treat us like suspects in one of your English country house charades. But we are at sea. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide a body, unless one feeds it to the fishes." "Precisely," Poirot said, "which makes the crime, when it comes, infinitely more revealing. Tell me, Monsieur le Comte, why do you wear a gardenia tonight, when all others have abandoned flowers in this storm?" Rochefort smiled, showing very white teeth. "Because I admire beauty that thrives in adverse conditions, monsieur, like Mademoiselle von Hofmannsthal." "Or like yourself." The Comte inclined his head. "Touché." Poirot leaned forward. "You knew Elias Goldstein before this voyage?" A flicker in the dark eyes. "We had business in Antwerp, diamonds, you understand, certain stones that should never have left Africa." Goldstein was nervous. He spoke of threats. "What kind of threats?" "The kind that arrive on black-edged cards." Rochefort set down his cup. "I told him to destroy the stones. He refused. Greed is a fatal disease, monsieur." "And you, did you perhaps decide to cure him of it?" The Comte rose in one fluid motion. "If I had wished Goldstein dead, he would be dead. Neatly, discreetly, and without theatrical playing cards. I do not play games, Poirot. I finish them." He left a scent of gardenia and danger hanging in the air. When the last passenger had gone, Poirot sat alone among the storm-lashed palms of the winter garden, and arranged his notes like a hand of patience. Queen of Spades, Goldstein, vanished. King of Spades, left in empty cabin. Ace of Spades, Ilsa's pillow, Jack of Spades, attack on Vale 4 cards. 4 moves. He turned to Captain Laroche, who had waited in silence. "Capitaine, I require 3 things. First, the passenger manifest with full names and exact suite numbers. Second, the ship's carpenter and a tape measure. Third," he tapped the little black ribbon on his lapel, "a complete list of every gardenia aboard this ship and who received them." Laroche stared. "Gardenias?" Poirot's smile was small and terrible. "Someone, mon ami, is signing their crimes with a flower. And flowers, unlike people, never lie." Lightning forked across the dome overhead, illuminating Poirot's face for an instant. Green eyes burning, moustaches bristling with purpose. Outside, the storm screamed like a living thing. Inside, the little Belgian began to close the net. Chapter 6. The storm approaches. The storm did not rage. It ruled. For 36 hours the Atlantic hurled itself against the ship in towering walls of black water. The Atlantica climbed each mountain of a wave, hung trembling at the crest, then plunged into valleys so deep the sky vanished. Propellers raced in air, shuddered, bit again. Every plate, every rivet groaned like a living creature in pain. Deck 7 became a gilded cage. The lifts were halted for safety. The companionways were guarded day and night. Meals were served in suites. Stewards staggered along corridors with trays held high, soup slopping like blood. No one complained. Fear of the storm outside had, for the moment, eclipsed fear of the killer within. But not for Hercule Poirot. He worked. He measured the exact height of every porthole above the waterline. He examined the scuffed carpet outside Goldstein's suite with a magnifying lens. He persuaded the ship's florist, a terrified little Breton, to open his refrigerated locker and count every remaining gardenia. 23 stems, all accounted for except the one found dying in 6th J. Most importantly, he listened. On the second night of the storm, at the lowest ebb of human spirits, he summoned Captain Laroche and Colonel Race to his suite. The three men sat around a small table, while the ship lurched drunkenly and the electric lights flickered like candles in a crypt. Poirot laid 4 playing cards in a precise row. Queen, king, ace, jack of spades. "Observe," he said, "a sequence, but not the sequence you think." Race frowned. "Queen first, then king, then ace, then jack. Seems clear enough." "Non." Poirot tapped the ace. "In certain old games the ace is low. The order is queen, king, jack, and the ace waits at the end, the final card, the death card." Laroche paled. "You are saying the killer has a list, and the ace is reserved for the last victim, or perhaps the most important." Race poured himself a stiff whiskey from Poirot's decanter. "Damned if I like this, Poirot. We're rats in a trap." "Rats, yes," Poirot agreed pleasantly, "but one rat has very sharp teeth." He produced a folded sheet, the passenger manifest, and placed it beside the cards. "Look at the suite numbers. Zefshuv A to 7K. 11 suites, 20 passengers because some share. Goldstein was as for J. Vale is 7K, the last cabin. The cards move forward along the deck like a tide." Laroche stared. "You mean the killer is working from stern to bow?" "Or from bow to stern. We shall see, but geography is important. Someone knows this deck intimately." At that moment, the ship gave a lurch violent enough to send the whiskey bottle crashing to the carpet. The lights died entirely. For 10 long seconds they sat in absolute darkness, listening to the storm scream and the hull shudder. When the lights returned, flickering, Poirot's face was pale but composed. "Messieurs," he said quietly, "I have asked the carpenter to do one more thing. Tonight he will remove the number plates from every door on deck 7 and replace them differently." Race almost choked. "Good God, man! You'll drive the passengers mad." "Better a little madness than another corpse," Poirot replied. "The killer navigates by numbers. Let us see how he, or she, behaves when the numbers lie." Laroche hesitated, then nodded. "It will be done within the hour." The storm covers all noise. They parted. Race to his cabin, Laroche to the bridge. Poirot remained alone, swaying with the ship's motion, eyes fixed on the 4 black cards. At 2:17 a.m., the lights failed again, this time for nearly 4 minutes. When they returned, the corridor outside Poirot's suite was empty. But on the carpet, exactly in front of door 7QE, now falsely labelled 7J, Goldstein's old cabin, lay a fresh gardenia and a new card. The 10 of spades. And written beneath it, in the same black ink, "Clever little Belgian. The game changes, so does the order." Poirot picked up the card with steady fingers. The flower was still dewed, cut less than an hour ago. He looked up and down the corridor. Every door was closed. No footprint, no sound but the storm and the endless creaking of the ship. "Eh bien," he murmured, "you are bold, mon adversaire, and you are close, very close." He went inside, locked his door, and for the first time on the voyage took his small Belgian army pistol from its chamois wrap and laid it on the nightstand beside his rosary. Outside, the storm reached its climax. The Atlantica plunged into a trough so profound that for one terrifying instant she seemed to stand on her stern. Somewhere far below, crockery avalanched in the galleys. A woman screamed once, high and hopeless. Then the bows rose again, water cascading from the forecastle in green waterfalls, and the ship lived for another minute. In the darkness of Suite 7B, Ilse von Hofmannsthal sat up in bed, clutching the covers to her throat. She had not screamed. She never screamed. But in her hand she held something that had not been there when she fell asleep. another card, the 2 of spades this time, and written across it in hurried pencil, "Forgive me. It was the only way." She stared at it until the words blurred. Then she slipped from bed, wrapped herself in a robe, and barefoot, silent, opened her door. The corridor was empty, the storm a deafening roar. She looked left, right, then padded quickly to the door that now bore the false number 7J. She raised her hand to knock, hesitated, lowered it. Instead, she slipped the 2 of spades under the door, turned, and fled back to her cabin. Behind her, unseen, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadow beside the companionway and watched her go. The storm howled on. Dawn, when it finally came, was the colour of old pewter. The wind had dropped to a sullen moan, but the sea still marched in long, oily swells. At 8 o'clock, Captain Laroche knocked on Poirot's door, face haggard. "Monsieur," he said without preamble, "we have another disappearance." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Who?" Laroche swallowed. "The Comte de Rochefort. His bed was not slept in. His evening clothes are laid out exactly as Goldstein's were, and in the middle of his sitting-room carpet he held out a silver salver. Upon it lay a single white gardenia and the 9 of spades. Poirot looked at the card for a long moment. Then he smiled, a small, terrible smile that had nothing of humour in it. "Eh bien," he said softly, "the game has indeed changed. And now, mes amis, the little grey cells must work faster than the storm." He glanced once more at the manifest, crossed out the Comte's name with a neat stroke of his fountain pen, and beneath it wrote a single word: Accelerando. Chapter 7. Secrets of the Staterooms. The second death, for death it now undoubtedly was, broke the passengers of Deck 7 as the storm had not. Captain Laroche assembled them at noon in the winter garden, now stripped of its palms and transformed into a court of inquiry. Rain still lashed the glass dome. The ship rolled heavily on the dying swell. 20 pale faces stared back at the captain. 19 now, minus Goldstein and the Comte de Rochefort. Laroche's voice was hoarse from shouting orders through the gale. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Comte de Rochefort's suite was searched at first light. His bed untouched, a porthole open, blood on the carpet, only a few drops, but fresh. And this." He held up the 9 of spades and the gardenia. "We must now face the truth. A murderer walks among us." A collective moan went up. Miss Wade began to cry noisily. Lady Horbury demanded smelling salts. Only 2 people remained perfectly still. Ilse von Hofmannsthal, white as the flower in Laroche's hand, and Lucien Vale, whose bandaged throat bobbed as he swallowed convulsively. Poirot rose. "Mesdames et messieurs, panic is the murderer's greatest ally. I ask only that you remain calm and truthful. Captain Laroche has authorized me to search every stateroom on this deck, immediately, no exceptions." An outraged babble erupted. Sir Gervais Chevenix surged to his feet. "Outrageous! My diplomatic papers will be treated with utmost respect," Poirot finished smoothly. "But if you refuse, Sir Gervais, I shall assume you have something to hide." Chevenix sat down again, purple-faced. Laroche nodded to his officers. The search began. It took 3 hours. They worked methodically, Poirot directing like a conductor, stewards lifting mattresses, officers tapping panels, the ship's carpenter probing for hidden compartments. Passengers stood in the corridor under guard, wrapped in furs and indignation. Most cabins yielded nothing but the usual clutter of the rich: jewels, morphine ampules, Lady Horbury, a loaded Webley revolver, Colonel Race, licensed, he insisted, and a surprising quantity of French postcards belonging to the Reverend Mr. Timms, who nearly fainted when they were discovered. But 3 suites gave up secrets, First, 7B, Ilse von Hofmannsthal. Beneath a false bottom in her jewel case lay a small velvet pouch. Poirot opened it and spilled onto the table a cascade of rough diamonds, blood red in the lamplight, uncut, worth a king's ransom. Ilse did not flinch. "They are mine," she said simply. "I bought them in Johannesburg in 1932, before Europe became difficult for people like me." Poirot weighed the pouch in his palm, and Elias Goldstein was transporting cut stones to match these, n'est-ce pas? A fortune in blood diamonds, hidden from the new German laws. That is why he was afraid. She met his gaze steadily. That is why someone wanted him silent. Second discovery, 70K, Lucien Vale. Behind a sliding panel in the wardrobe, the searchers found a complete set of black silk clothing, hooded mask, gloves, soft-soled shoes, and a thin Italian stiletto still bearing a trace of fresh blood. Vale stared at the bundle as though it belonged to a stranger. "I have never seen these things," he whispered. "Someone is trying to destroy me." Poirot lifted the stiletto with a handkerchief. "The blade matches the wound on your own throat, monsieur." Curious, the young man began to shake uncontrollably. And finally, the greatest shock. Suite 7F, occupied by the colourless secretary Miss Grey, who had accompanied Lady Horbury. The cabin was almost monastic in its austerity, until Poirot tapped the headboard and felt a hollow sound. A concealed drawer slid open. Inside lay a neat stack of playing cards, everyone a spade, a stick of black sealing wax, a fountain pen with violet ink, and a single white gardenia pressed flat between sheets of tissue like a murdered butterfly. But the true revelation was a photograph. It showed a young woman in Edwardian dress standing on the deck of a liner. The old Imperator, before she became the Atlantica. The woman's face was unmistakably that of Miss Grey, though 30 years younger. On the back in faded ink, "To my darling Beatrice, who should have been the last passenger of Deck 7, 1914. Poirot turned slowly. Miss Grey stood in the doorway, watched by 2 officers, her plain face suddenly luminous with a strange, terrible peace. "So," she said softly, "the time for hiding is over." Lady Horbury shrieked, "Beatrice Grey, you are dismissed. I shall—" "Silence!" Poirot's voice cracked like a whip. "Capitaine Laroche, I believe we have found our ghost." Miss Grey smiled, an expression so radiant it was almost frightening. "Not a ghost, Monsieur Poirot. A promise kept. 31 years ago, my fiancé threw himself from this deck after gambling away everything we owned. He left me a note and a single white gardenia. The ship's company hushed it up. I swore one day I would make them remember." She looked around the circle of shocked faces. "I have waited a long time. Then, last month, I learned that 20 of the richest, most corrupt people in Europe would sail together on the very deck where my Henry died. I bought my passage as a secretary. I arranged the cards, the flowers, the fear. Goldstein recognized me. Rochefort guessed. They had to go first." Her voice never rose above a conversational tone. "I planned to finish with the ace of spades on the final night, then vanish myself, the last passenger of Deck 7, as I should have been in 1914. A long silence followed, broken only by the creak of the ship. Poirot regarded her with profound sadness. "Madame," he said gently, "you have confessed to 2 murders and the terrorizing of innocence. But there are details that do not fit. The 2 of spades slipped under a door last night, begging forgiveness. That was not the act of a merciless avenger. And the 10 of spades left after the numbers were changed. Only someone who knew the true cabins could have done that." He stepped closer. You are many things, Miss Grey, but you are not the killer we seek. You are a distraction, a magnificent, tragic distraction." Miss Grey's composure cracked for the first time. "Then who?" Poirot turned to the assembled passengers, eyes glittering. "That, mes amis, is what we discover next, because the real murderer has just made a fatal mistake." He held up the pressed gardenia from Miss Grey's drawer. "This flower is 31 years old. Real gardenias last only days. Therefore, someone has been supplying fresh ones to maintain the legend." He looked straight at Ilse von Hofmannsthal. "Someone who grows them in a private hothouse on board. Someone who knew the story of Deck 7 long before this voyage began. Someone who needed Miss Grey to take the blame, while the true motive, those diamonds, remained hidden." Ilse's hand went to her throat. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "The game is almost over, mademoiselle. The next card will be the last." Outside, the storm had passed. A watery sun broke through the clouds, gilding the wet decks, but on Deck 7 the temperature seemed to plummet. Chapter 8. The Midnight Scream. The third night after the storm was unnaturally still. The Atlantic lay like polished obsidian beneath a sky rinsed clean of cloud. A thin crescent moon hung low, sharp enough to cut silk. The ship's engines had slowed. Somewhere in the darkness a wail sounded, a long mournful sigh that echoed through every corridor of Deck 7. At 11:30, Captain Laroche ordered every passenger to remain in their suites. Armed stewards stood at both ends of the private corridor. The lights were left burning full. No one was to open their door until sunrise. Hercule Poirot, however, did not intend to wait for sunrise. He sat alone in the winter garden, fully dressed, a small travelling clock ticking softly on the table before him. At his elbow lay the entire sequence of spades now recovered. Queen, King, Jack, 10, 9, 2, Ace. Only 3 cards remained unplayed. The 8, the 7, and the final, inevitable Ace. He had arranged them in a perfect fan, like a hand of cards waiting to be taken. At 11:55 the lights dimmed, not the flicker of a storm, but a deliberate reduction, as though someone in the engine room had turned a wheel. Poirot did not move. At 11:58 the corridor lights died entirely, plunging Deck 7 into absolute darkness. 30 seconds later came the scream. It was not the theatrical shriek of a frightened heiress. It was raw, animal, torn from the throat of someone who had seen the face of their own death. It rose, cracked, and was abruptly cut off, as though a hand had been clamped over the mouth that made it. Then silence. Poirot was already moving. He stepped into the corridor with the calm of a man who has expected exactly this. The emergency lamps glowed a dull red, enough to see the shapes of doors and the white faces of stewards who had drawn revolvers. "Which cabin?" Poirot snapped. "7B, monsieur. Mademoiselle von Hofmannsthal's." The door stood ajar. A thin blade of yellow light spilled out, trembling. Poirot pushed it wide. Ilse von Hofmannsthal lay on the carpet between bed and dressing table, black satin nightgown rucked up around her thighs, one arm flung out as though reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Her golden hair had come unpinned. It spread across the carpet like spilled honey. Her throat had been cut with surgical precision. Blood, still bright, soaked the carpet in a perfect oval. Above her, pinned to the mirror with the same thin stiletto that had threatened Lucian Vale, was the 8 of spades. And on the dressing table, arranged like an altar, lay every piece of jewellery she had worn since Southampton, pearls, emeralds, the sapphire clips. And in the centre, the velvet pouch of rough diamonds, open, empty. Only one thing was missing, the gardenia she always wore behind her ear. Poirot knelt, touched 2 fingers to her neck, though he already knew. The body was still warm. He looked up at the mirror. Written across it in Ilse's own crimson lipstick were 4 words: "The Black Orchid fades." Captain Laroche arrived breathless, revolver in hand. "Mon Dieu, Poirot, she is dead, yes, less than 3 minutes ago. The killer was in this room when the lights went out, and left while we were still finding our feet in the dark." Laroche stared at the empty pouch. "The diamonds are now in the pocket of the person who murdered 3 people to possess them." Poirot stood, eyes sweeping the room. The porthole was closed and dogged. The door had been locked from the inside. The key still hung on its ribbon around Ilse's wrist. "Impossible," Laroche whispered. "A locked room. Non, a room that wished to appear locked." Poirot pointed to the communicating door that connected 7B to the adjoining suite, 7C. "That door was supposed to be bolted on both sides. It is not." He crossed and opened it. Suite 7C belonged to Lucien Vale. The artist sat on the floor of his sitting room, knees drawn up, face buried in his hands. When the door opened, he looked up, eyes huge and glassy with shock. "I heard her scream," he said in a broken voice. "I ran to the door, but it was locked. I beat on it. I called her name, but then nothing." Poirot regarded him for a long moment. "Monsieur Vale," he said softly, "where is your gardenia?" Vale blinked. The flower you wore tonight. The one you took from Mademoiselle Ilse's hair during dinner. You pressed it between the pages of your sketchbook. Where is the sketchbook now?" Vale's gaze slid involuntarily to the writing desk. The sketchbook lay open. The pressed gardenia was gone. Poirot closed the book with a soft snap. "Captain Laroche," he said without turning, "place Monsieur Lucien Vale under arrest for the murder of Ilse von Hofmannsthal, Elias Goldstein, and the Comte de Rochefort." Vale surged to his feet. "No! I loved her! I would never!" Poirot's voice cut like a blade. "You loved her so much that you killed everyone who stood between you and the fortune she carried. You used the legend of Deck 7, the mad Miss Grey, the playing cards, to create terror and confusion. You wore the black mask. You left the gardenias because you knew they would point to her, not to you. And tonight, when the diamonds were finally within reach, you cut her throat and took them." Vale backed away until the wall stopped him. "You cannot prove, but I can." Poirot produced from his pocket a tiny shard of green glass. This was found in Mademoiselle Ilse's hand. She tore it from the murderer's cufflink as she died. Emerald glass, hand-painted with a tiny black orchid. You had them made in Vienna, monsieur, to match her eyes. I noticed them the first evening. One is missing." Vale looked at his left cuff. The empty setting glinted dully. His face crumpled. "She promised we would be married," he whispered. "She promised the diamonds would buy us a new life in America. Then, tonight, she laughed at me. She said I was a useful fool, nothing more. She was going to give them to Rochefort after all." His voice broke completely. "I didn't mean to kill her. I only wanted to frighten her. But the knife, it went in so easily." He slid down the wall and began to sob. Great, tearing sobs that shook his whole body. Laroche signalled. 2 officers hauled Vale to his feet and led him away. Poirot stood alone in the silent suite, looking down at the body of the woman who had once filled opera houses with her voice. "Pauvre petite," he murmured. "You played for the highest stakes, and you lost." He bent, gently closed her eyes, and placed the missing gardenia behind her ear, where it belonged. Then he turned out the light. Chapter 9. Allies and Adversaries. The arrest of Lucien Vale should have ended it. At 4 a.m, Captain Laroche had the artist locked in the brig, wrists in steel cuffs, the bloodied stiletto and the empty velvet pouch laid on the table before him like evidence at a tribunal. The diamonds themselves, 27 stones of murderous beauty, were recovered from the lining of Vale's paint-box, wrapped in a rag stiff with cadmium red. Yet Poirot was not satisfied. He stood on the boat deck at dawn, collar turned up against the knife-edged wind, watching the sun rise out of a sea the colour of tarnished pewter. Gulls followed the ship now. Land could not be far. Captain Laroche joined him, offering a silver flask of coffee laced with rum. "You should sleep, monsieur. The monster is caught." Poirot accepted the flask but did not drink. "Non, mon ami. A monster, yes, but not the only one." Laroche stared. "You have the murderer, the weapon, the motive, the diamonds." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "several small details gnaw at the little grey cells, like mice at a cathedral candle." He counted on his gloved fingers. Première, the 2 of spades slipped under a door begging forgiveness. Vale did not write that. He felt no remorse until the mask was torn away. Deuxième, the 10 of spades left after the cabin numbers were changed. Vale was under guard in the winter garden at that hour. He could not have placed it. Troisième, the open portholes. A man of Vale's slight build could wriggle through, yes, but to haul a struggling adult overboard? Impossible without noise, without trace. And finally, Poirot turned to face the captain, eyes glittering. The scream we heard tonight was real, but Ilse von Hofmannsthal had her throat cut from ear to ear. She could not have screamed after the blade passed. Therefore the scream came before. Someone wanted us to arrive too late. Laroche's face went the colour of tallow. "You are saying Vale had an accomplice still at large?" "I am saying," Poirot corrected gently, "that Lucien Vale is a pawn who believed himself a knight. Someone else is playing the chessboard." He drew from his pocket the sequence of spades again, and laid the 8 on the rail between them. 8 cards have been played. 5 remain, 7, 6, 5, 4, and the second ace. In certain games, my friend, there are 2 aces of spades. One is death, the other is resurrection. Laroche crossed himself, though he was not a Catholic. "Then who—" A sudden shout from the bridge wing cut him short. "Captain! Monsieur Poirot! Quickly!" They ran. Colonel Race met them at the head of the companionway, face grim beneath the scarlet dawn. "It's Miss Grey," he said. "She's asking for Poirot. Says she won't speak to anyone else. And she's— well, see for yourself." They found Beatrice Grey in the ship's hospital, seated upright in a chair despite the surgeon's protests. Someone had given her a clean blouse and skirt. Her grey hair was neatly pinned. Only her eyes betrayed the abyss she had stared into. She waited until the door closed behind the surgeon, then spoke in a voice as dry as dead leaves. "I lied to you, Monsieur Poirot, not about Henry, never about Henry, but about the cards." She opened her hand. In the palm lay the 7 of spades, edges worn soft, as though it had been carried for years. "This one is mine, from 1914. Henry tucked it into my prayer book the night he jumped. I have carried it ever since, waiting for the right moment to leave it on deck 7 as his memorial." She placed it on the counterpane. "But the others, the Queen, the King, the 8, all of them, were new. Someone stole my story and twisted it into murder." Poirot inclined his head. "I know." "Then you also know," she said, "that I am dying. The surgeon found a growth. Months, perhaps weeks. I came on this voyage to finish what Henry began. To make the rich remember that lives are not chips in their games. I wanted fear, not blood." Tears shone in her eyes, but did not fall. "Someone used me, monsieur. Used my grief as camouflage. Promise me you will find them before we reach New York. Promise me Henry's ghost will not be left to carry their sins." Poirot took her hand, thin, cold, trembling, and pressed it gently. "You have the word of Hercule Poirot." She closed her eyes, exhausted. "There is one more thing. Last night, before the scream, I saw a shadow leave 7B by the communicating door. Not Lucien Vale, taller, broader in the shoulder, and the scent not gardenia, violets." "Violets," Poirot repeated very softly. He left her with the surgeon and walked the corridor deep in thought. Colonel Race fell into step beside him. "Anything I can do, old man?" Poirot stopped outside Suite 7th, Sir Gervais Chevenix's cabin, and regarded the colonel steadily. "Tell me, mon colonel, when you were in Punjab, did you ever hunt tiger with a tethered goat?" Race frowned. "Once or twice. Nasty business." "Precisely. The goat is tied to a stake. The tiger comes for the easy kill, but the hunters wait in the mashan above." He placed a hand on Race's arm. "Tonight, my friend, we tether a goat." Race's eyes narrowed, then widened with understanding. "You mean to use yourself as bait?" "No, I am too obvious. The tiger has seen me. But there is one passenger who has been almost invisible these last days, who has never been searched thoroughly because she is considered above suspicion, who wears violet scent, and whose husband once owned half the diamond mines of Kimberley, before he lost everything to Elias Goldstein in a rigged game of chemin de fer." Race whistled softly. "Lady Horbury." "Exactly. Tonight she will receive a note, supposedly from Lucien Vale, confessing that the diamonds are hidden in the lining of her sable coat, and begging her to bring the coat to the boat deck at midnight to throw it overboard, saving him from the gallows." Race looked uneasy. "Dangerous, Poirot." "Life," said Poirot with a small, fierce smile, "is dangerous, but Hercule Poirot is more dangerous still." He turned away, already composing the forged note in his head. Behind him, the ship's bell struck 6 clear notes into the morning. 4 bells, 18 hours until midnight. The tiger was hungry, and the goat was being prepared. Chapter 10. The Forgotten Deck. Midnight, the 4th night. The SS Atlantica glided through a sea of molten silver. The moon had swollen to a perfect disk, so bright it bleached colour from the world. Every porthole along deck 7 glowed amber, yet the private promenade was deserted, the boat deck above it silent. Lady Horbury stepped out of the lift at 11:58, clutching a long sable coat over one arm, as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her face was powdered marble, her eyes darted like trapped birds. She had come alone, against the captain's orders, drawn by greed and the promise of a murderer's gratitude. She did not see the 3 men who watched from the shadows of the lifeboat davits. Captain Laroche with a revolver, Colonel Race with a service Webley, and Hercule Poirot, small and motionless as a black chess piece. Lady Horbury reached the appointed spot beneath the 3rd lifeboat where a single deck chair had been placed as a marker. She looked around, breath pluming in the cold. "Vale?" she whispered harshly. "Where are you?" Silence answered. Then from the darkness above the funnel came the low, mournful note of the ship's whistle. 3 blasts the signal for man overboard. Lady Horbury started violently. The sable coat slipped from her arm and fell open on the deck. Diamonds, dozens of them, glittered across the teak planking like scattered stars. She dropped to her knees, scrabbling for them with greedy fingers. That was when the attack came. A figure in black dropped from the boat deck on a rope as neatly as a stage assassin, masked, gloved, silent. The stiletto flashed once in the moonlight. Lady Horbury had time for one choked scream before Colonel Race's bullet took the attacker in the shoulder and spun him like a top. The knife clattered away. The masked figure crashed to the deck, rolled, and came up running. Poirot's voice rang out, calm and terrible. "Stop him! He must not reach the rail!" But the man was desperate. He vaulted the rail in a single motion, hung for an instant against the sky, then let go of the rope and dropped, not into the sea, but onto the narrow, forgotten ledge that ran beneath the lifeboats. A maintenance catwalk known to sailors as the ghost deck, invisible from above, unused since the war. Race fired again. The bullet sparked off steel. The figure vanished into shadow. Laroche cursed in fluent Marseille French. "He knows the ship better than we do." Poirot was already moving. There is only one way down from the ghost deck, an old companionway behind the first-class gymnasium. "Race, with me! Laroche, guard the woman!" They ran. Down 2 decks, along a service corridor smelling of paint and hot oil, past startled stewards who flattened themselves against the bulkhead. They reached the rusted iron door marked "No Admittance, Crew Only." Stood ajar. Beyond it, a narrow ladder descended into blackness. Poirot did not hesitate. He went down first, small feet sure on the slippery rungs. Race followed, revolver ready. The ghost deck was a relic of the ship's German past, a cramped open walkway running the full length of the hull beneath the lifeboats, open to the sea on one side, pressed against the steel plates on the other. Moonlight slanted through the davit arms above, striping the planks silver and black. Halfway along, the wounded man leaned against the rail, one hand clamped to his shoulder, blood black in the moonlight. He turned as they approached. The mask had slipped. Beneath it was the face of Sir Gervais Chevenix's diplomat clubman, and now murderer. Race's revolver did not waver. "Drop the knife, Gervais." Sir Gervais smiled, a thin, aristocratic smile. "Too late, Archibald, far too late." He opened his blood-slick hand. In it lay the 7 of spades, the missing card. Poirot stepped forward, unafraid. "You used Vale exactly as you used Miss Grey. You fed the boy's passion. You planted the mask and the knife in his cabin. You wrote the notes in violet ink, your wife's favourite scent. You killed Goldstein and Rochefort yourself, then murdered Ilse when she realized the truth. All for diamonds you believed rightfully yours after Goldstein ruined your family in 27. Sir Gervais's eyes glittered. "He took everything, my estates, my daughter's future, my name. I have waited 8 years for restitution. And Lady Horbury? A useful fool. She was to take the blame tonight. The note was in Vale's handwriting. I forced him to copy it. When her body was found with the diamonds, the case would close." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. Poirot's voice was soft. "But you made one mistake, Sir Gervais. You left the 2 of spades begging forgiveness. That was meant for Ilse, was it not? The only person you ever loved." Sir Gervais's face twisted. "She was going to betray me again. Just like Vienna in 19. I had no choice." He looked past Poirot to the black water rushing below. "Goodbye, Hercule. Tell London I died as I lived, a gentleman." Before Race could fire, Sir Gervais stepped backward over the rail. For a heartbeat, He hung against the moon, coat flapping like broken wings. Then the sea took him without a sound. Race lowered his revolver slowly. Poirot stood motionless, watching the empty space where a man had been. "Another ghost for Deck 7, he murmured. Far above, the ship's bell struck 4 times 2 o'clock. They climbed back in silence. Lady Horbury was sitting in the deck chair, wrapped in a blanket, diamonds returned to the pouch at her feet. She looked suddenly old and very small. Captain Laroche met them at the top of the ladder. "It is finished?" he asked. Poirot shook his head. "Non, mon capitaine. 1 card remains unplayed." He held up the 7 of spades Sir Gervais had carried to his death. On the back, written in violet ink, were the words, "The true ace comes at dawn." Poirot looked toward the east, where the first pale stain of morning was already creeping across the sky. "Prepare the passengers," he said quietly. "At sunrise we assemble in the winter garden. There will be no more blood, I promise you. Only truth." Race stared at him. "You know who the last player is?" Poirot's eyes were very green in the growing light. "I have known since the gardenia that was 31 years old suddenly bloomed again. Come, the forgotten deck has given up its secrets. Now the living must do the same." Chapter 11. Confrontations at Dawn. The winter garden, 5:45 a.m. The glass dome had turned the colour of pale rose quartz. The Atlantic beyond it was a sheet of hammered gold. Every passenger still alive on Deck 7 sat in a semicircle facing the small table where Hercule Poirot waited, hands folded, face grave. 18 chairs, 18 survivors. Captain Laroche stood behind Poirot, revolver holstered but ready. Colonel Race flanked the door. 2 armed officers guarded the companionway. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft thrum of engines and the distant cry of gulls. Poirot began without preamble. 2 hours ago, Sir Gervais Chevenix went into the sea, taking with him 3 lives and a fortune in diamonds that will never now be recovered. He believed himself the author of this tragedy. He was mistaken. He was, in the end, only another victim. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Lady Horbury gave a strangled cry. "You said it was finished." "No, madame. I said there would be no more blood. The game, however, still lacks its final play." Poirot placed the 7 of spades in the centre of the table. "This card was found on Sir Gervais's body. On the back, a promise. The true ace comes at dawn." He looked slowly around the circle, letting his gaze rest on each face. "Someone in this room conceived the entire drama. Someone chose the legend of Deck 7, the playing cards, the gardenias. Someone recruited Sir Gervais as assassin, Lucien Vale as scapegoat, Miss Grey as ghost. Someone arranged every disappearance, every scream, every locked room. That person is here now, waiting for the applause that will never come." He paused. "And that person is you, Colonel Race." A collective gasp. Race himself went very still. Poirot continued, voice gentle, relentless. "You knew the ship's hidden ways, the ghost deck, the service ladders, from your years in military intelligence. You knew Sir Gervais's hatred of Goldstein. You fed it. You knew Lucien Vale's hopeless passion for Ilsa. You armed it. You knew Miss Grey's tragedy. You twisted it into terror. And you knew where the diamonds were hidden, because you placed them in Ilsa's luggage yourself, in Southampton before the voyage began." Race's face had become a mask of stone. "You have no proof, Poirot." "Have every proof." Poirot produced a small envelope and spilled its contents onto the table. A single cufflink of emerald glass painted with a black orchid. Ilsa tore this from her murderous wrist. Sir Gervais wore plain gold links. You, mon colonel, had these made in Vienna, a gift for Ilse that she refused. I found the matching pair in your cabin yesterday, hidden inside a box of Webley cartridges. He laid a second object beside it, a tiny vial of violet essence. Your wife's scent, the scent Miss Grey noticed on the real killer. Race's hand moved a fraction toward his holster. Colonel Race's voice was almost amused. Clever Poirot, but why? I have no need of diamonds. Poirot's eyes never left his, because in 1919 in Simla, a young subaltern named Archibald Race was cashiered for selling regimental rifles to Afghan rebels. You reinvented yourself, rose high, but the file never disappeared. Elias Goldstein owned that file. He was bringing it to New York to sell to the War Office for a fortune. You could not buy his silence, so you arranged for him to vanish, along with everyone who might connect you to the crime. He leaned forward. The perfect locked-room mystery at sea. No police, no escape, terror to paralyze witnesses. And when it was done, you would be the hero who helped Poirot unmask the madman Sir Gervas. Race smiled, a terrible smile. And now? Now, Poirot said quietly, the game ends. Race moved like lightning. His Webley cleared leather and roared once. The bullet shattered a pane of the glass dome above Poirot's head. But Colonel Race had forgotten one thing. Captain Laroche had served 20 years in the French Navy. His revolver spoke a fraction of a second later. The bullet took Race in the right shoulder, spinning him half around. Race staggered, blood blooming across his white dinner jacket. For a moment he stood swaying, eyes fixed on Poirot with something almost like admiration. Then his knees buckled and he fell forward across the table, scattering the spades like black petals. Silence. Poirot knelt beside the fallen man, felt for a pulse, and shook his head. He's gone! Lady Horbury began to scream hysterically. Miss Wade fainted clean away. The Reverend Timms prayed aloud in a trembling voice. Poirot rose and faced the stunned passengers. "It is finished," he said simply. "The cards have all been played." He gathered the scattered spades, straightened them into a perfect pack, and placed on top the one card that had never appeared. The second ace of spades. On its face, in Race's neat military hand, were written 3 words, check and mate. Poirot slipped the pack into his pocket. "Some games," he said softly, "are won only when both kings are dead." Outside, the sun cleared the horizon, flooding the winter garden with sudden blinding light. New York was less than a day away. Chapter 12. The last passenger revealed, the winter garden, 1 hour after sunrise. The glass dome blazed like a furnace. Shards of broken pane glittered on the carpet like frost. Colonel Race's body had been removed. Only a dark stain on the parquet remained, already being scrubbed by a silent steward. The 18 survivors sat in stunned silence. No one wept. They had passed beyond tears. Poirot stood alone at the table, the pack of spades in his hands. He turned it over once, twice, as though weighing a living thing. Then he spoke, very quietly. "Mesdames et messieurs, you have heard many truths this morning, but not the final one. Colonel Race was a murderer, yes. He arranged deaths. He manipulated pawns. He fired the last shot. Yet even he was not the hand that first dealt these cards." He laid the pack down and fanned it with a single motion. Every card was the ace of spades. 20 identical aces stared up at them, black and merciless. A low moan escaped Lady Horbury. Lucian Vale, brought up from the brig in irons, went white as chalk. Poirot's voice cut through the rising panic. In the beginning, there were 20 passengers on deck 7. Now, there are 18 living, 1 in custody, and 1 in the sea. Yet the manifest still reads 20 names. One name has never been spoken aloud in this room. One passenger has never sat among us." He turned to the empty chair at the far end of the semicircle. "Will the 20th passenger please stand?" No one moved. Poirot smiled, a small, sad smile. "Very well, then Hercule Poirot will name you." He walked slowly along the row of chairs until he stood before Miss Beatrice Grey. The woman who had confessed, who had carried a 31-year-old card in her prayer book, who had seemed the perfect ghost. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Yes," she said simply, "it was always me." A collective gasp. Poirot inclined his head. "From the very first. You booked this passage 6 months ago, not as Lady Horbury's secretary. That was arranged later to give you access. But as yourself. You paid for the entire complement of gardenias in the ship's hothouse. You commissioned Lucien Vale to paint portraits that would never be finished. You whispered the legend of Deck 7 into every ear that would listen. You created the terror. You chose the victims. You even wrote the forged note that lured Sir Gervais to his death tonight, knowing he would confess rather than face disgrace." Miss Grey rose. She seemed to grow taller, straighter, as though a great weight had fallen from her shoulders. "I did not kill with my own hands," she said, and her voice was steady now, almost serene. "That was Race's part, and Gervais's, and poor mad Lucien's. I only arranged the board." She looked around the circle of shocked faces. 31 years ago, Henry Carstairs jumped from this deck because men like Goldstein and Rochefort and Race ruined him at cards. They took his fortune, his honour, his life. The ship's company covered it up. No inquiry, no justice. Only a white gardenia on a pillow, and a promise that I would make the world remember. She turned to Poirot. "I studied you, monsieur. I knew if anyone could solve an impossible crime, it was Hercule Poirot. So I built the perfect crime, one that required your presence to be complete. 20 strangers, a locked deck, a legend, and a detective brilliant enough to see through every layer of deception, until the final layer." She reached into her pocket and drew out one last card, the only genuine ace of spades in the pack. On the back, in faded ink from 1914, were the words for Henry. "The last passenger returns." She placed it on the table. "I am the 20th passenger, I always was. The rest, the disappearances, the blood, the diamonds, were the price of memory." Silence, absolute and suffocating. Captain Laroche found his voice first. "You will be arrested, madame." Miss Grey smiled. "Of course. And tried, and hanged perhaps. But Henry's name will be in every newspaper from here to Bombay. The rich will remember that even on the highest deck, death can be bought for the price of a gardenia." She extended her wrists to the officers without being asked. As the handcuffs clicked shut, she looked once more at Poirot. "You promised me no more blood. You kept your word. Thank you." Poirot bowed, very slightly. "You used me, madame. Yet in the end, you also used yourself. That is the most terrible vengeance of all." They led her away. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor like slow heartbeats. Poirot remained alone in the winter garden. He gathered the 20 false aces, tore them neatly in half, and let the pieces flutter into the wastebasket like black snow. Only one card remained whole, the true ace, with Henry's message. He slipped it into his pocketbook beside the photograph of his own long-dead brother. Outside, the Statue of Liberty rose out of the morning mist, torch gleaming. New York, the voyage was over. Chapter 13. Resolution on the horizon. The SS Atlantica tied up at Pier 90 on a bright cold morning that smelled of coffee and tar. Reporters swarmed the gangway like gulls, shouting questions in 3 languages. Flashbulbs popped. Somewhere a band played "The Stars and Stripes Forever," absurdly cheerful. Hercule Poirot descended last, coat buttoned to the throat, valises carried by a respectful purser. He paused at the foot of the gangplank and looked back once at Deck 7. Its private promenade was empty now, windows blank in the sunlight. Captain Laroche joined him, cap under his arm. "You leave us with heavy hearts, monsieur, and heavier headlines." Poirot gave a small, tired smile. "Headlines fade, mon capitaine. Memory does not." They shook hands French fashion, and Poirot turned to go. A steward ran up, breathless. "Monsieur Poirot, a lady asks to see you before you leave the ship. She is waiting in the first-class writing room." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "A lady?" He followed the steward back aboard. The writing room was deserted except for one figure seated at the central table. A woman in a plain grey travelling dress, veil lifted, hands folded quietly in her lap. Beatrice Grey. The handcuffs were gone. In their place she wore soft kid gloves. She rose as Poirot entered and closed the door. "You are surprised," she said. Poirot regarded her steadily. "Surprised that the American authorities released you so swiftly?" "Yes." "Surprised that you are free to walk down the gangway?" "Very much." She gave a faint, wintry smile. "There will be no trial, monsieur. The British Foreign Office has decided, quietly, that too many distinguished names would be damaged. Goldstein, Rochefort, Sir Gervais, Colonel Race, their secrets die with them. Lady Horbury has already sailed for Bermuda with what remains of her reputation. Lucien Vale has been committed to an asylum in Connecticut. He will never speak coherently again. The diamonds are at the bottom of the Atlantic. And She opened her handbag and took out a single white gardenia, fresh as the morning. "I am returning to England on the next ship, 3rd class. No one will notice an elderly spinster governess." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You planned this also?" "From the beginning," she admitted. "I needed the world to remember Henry's name for 1 week. 1 week of scandal in every newspaper was all the vengeance I ever wanted. After that, justice could be silent." She placed the gardenia on the table between them. "You could have exposed me at the end," she said softly. "You chose not to. Why?" Poirot picked up the flower, twirled it once between his fingers. "Because, madame, there are crimes of passion and crimes of greed. Yours was the first. And because Hercule Poirot is not always the servant of the law. Sometimes he is the servant of something older." He tucked the gardenia into his buttonhole. "Also," he added with the ghost of a twinkle, "I dislike being anyone's puppet. But in your case, the puppet master was a lady of rare quality." Beatrice Grey looked at him for a long moment. Then, quite suddenly, she leaned forward and kissed him once on the forehead, a blessing rather than a liberty. "Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot. Thank you for giving Henry back his name." She walked past him, head high, and disappeared down the corridor without looking back. Poirot stood alone in the empty writing room. Sunlight poured through the portholes, striking green fire from his eyes. He took from his pocket the true ace of spades, the one with Henry's faded message, and turned it over. On the blank side, in Beatrice Grey's neat copper plate, 2 new lines had been added some time during the night. "You were right, monsieur. The last passenger was never Henry. It was always me." Poirot smiled, a small, perfect smile of acknowledgement and farewell. He slipped the card back into his pocket-book, adjusted the gardenia in his lapel, and walked down the gangway into the bright American morning. Behind him, the great liner prepared for her next voyage, already forgetting the blood on Deck 7. But in the breast pocket of Hercule Poirot, pressed between the photograph of a brother and the promise of a ghost, one white gardenia and one worn playing card would travel with him for the rest of his life. Some mysteries, after all, are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be remembered.